Hello, 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 hello. Thank you for coming out here. It's May 14th. We're supposed to be heading into summer, right? I'm going to be talking about the Summer of Love, 1967. I expect snow out there. I had the heat on last night. May 13th. I'm not supposed to have the heat on. Anyway, thank you for coming. My name is Weiner. I have been in radio and TV since 1971 when I was 15 years old. Also written for newspapers and magazines, and most of the places I work for are out of business. Just how the business is. I've been doing a series of talks that started out last year, or 2 years ago now. The Larchmont Library asked me whether or not I could do a talk on 1968. My background being radio and TV, and how 1968, the war and everything else came into your home. So I've done the 1969 talk, I've done all kinds of talks about 1950s TV, and so it seemed kind of natural that I talk about 1967. Now, all of you in this room were here. Well, not all of you in this room were here. I get two people here who probably for them, it's more interesting talking about 1967 than you. You lived through 1967. But I was looking back, and as I was doing the 1968 talks and 1969 talks, there's cause and effect. Things just didn't happen in 1968 without any foundation, nor did they happen in 1969. We had a hippie movement starting in 1967, and we had all kind of other things. Now, this guy behind me here, some of you probably heard of him, some of you probably not. Tune in, turn on, drop out. Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary told people it's okay to take drugs back in 1966, 67. Part of the counterculture. I'm not going to ask any of you who might have agreed with Timothy Leary or might have disagreed with Timothy Leary, but one of the things Timothy Leary liked was acid. And acid was around in, you're laughing at that? 1967. Do you know anybody on acid in 1967? Oh no, never, never, never. That's Timothy Leary. Now, in California, you went from one extreme to the other extreme. This is, well, before we get to the California, this is rioting that took place in 1967, the so-called Summer of Love. There was rioting. There was also this, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So you have contrast after contrast. And then there was this, as that album came out, the Six-Day War in the Middle East with Israel and Egypt and Syria. So you have, on one hand, Sgt. Pepper, on the other hand, a major war break out in the Middle East. You also had Jimi Hendrix. Any Jimi Hendrix fans here? No, why would I think Mike would be a Jimi Hendrix fan? I just don't know why. You went to Woodstock, right? You saw Jimmy at Woodstock, right? Yeah. Yes, you did. So there was also Jimi Hendrix at the Monterey Pop Festival. And there was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan became the governor of California in 1967. Like I said, tons of contrast. But the question that I have for you, who were there in 1967 and might have partaken in something or might not have partaken in something, was the summer of 1967 the summer of love, or was it the summer of something else? You could probably say, yeah, it was the summer of love, and yeah, it was the summer of something else. There were hippies in San Francisco, and while there were hippies in San Francisco, the Army shipped out people to Vietnam right across the San Francisco Bay in Oakland. Oakland was, for a lot of soldiers who ended up in Vietnam, the last place they saw in the United States. They were shipped to Vietnam from Oakland. Oakland is just 8 miles across the bay from San Francisco. The war in Vietnam, war in the Middle East. The psychologist Timothy Leary was a big part of the counterculture and the hippie movement. And in San Francisco, at Golden State Park, which is near the Golden State Bridge, he told about 30,000 hippies, turn on, tune in, and drop out. the hippie lifestyle, as Timothy Leary thought it was, take a lot of drugs. Meanwhile, as Timothy Leary is talking to the hippies, there's rioting on the streets of Detroit, the streets of Newark. So here you got a whole bunch of hippies, well not a whole bunch, 3 hippies go in there, and in the summer, 2 narratives. One, fire bases, napalm, jungles, the draft, all about Vietnam. The other, LSD, flowers in your hair, Scott McKenzie. If you go into San Francisco, make sure you put flowers in your hair. Remember that song? Okay, Scott McKenzie. Rock music, San Francisco of all places. San Francisco of all places is the epicenter of both what would become the silent majority and the counterculture, the hippies. San Francisco is a tale of 2 cities. Not quite San Francisco. That's Oakland. Oakland, California. U.S. Army, Oakland, port of embarkation. That is where you were shipped to Vietnam. This was the last place you saw in the United States, surrounded by barbed wire. The U.S. Army. Now, before you left for Vietnam, if you were in Oakland, you went across the San Francisco Bay Bridge. There was no BART in those days, so you had to take a car over there. And you generally, before you went to Vietnam, you went to go party with the hippies. The Bay Area was the last place for servicemen. By 1967, there were 500,000 servicemen in Vietnam. That was up from 23,000 men in 1965. It exploded exponentially by 1967. 200,000 of those troops were in Oakland. When they were in Oakland, they decided, hey, let's go see the hippies. That may be the last thing we see. Maybe the last train to Clarksville. Remember that song? Yeah. The last train to Clarksville. What was that song about the monkeys about? That was like, I'm going to Vietnam. I may never see you again, so come see me before I go to Vietnam. That was Haight-Ashbury. Also, some other things started in 1967. How many football fans are in here? Football fans. You got a few. Well, the Super Bowl started. Los Angeles, California. Another California place. Los Angeles, California on January 15th, 1967. That's the Kansas City Chiefs. That's the Green Bay Packers. And in this picture, you see empty seats. There were a lot of empty seats for what was known as the American Football League, National Football League World Championship game. It had not become the Super Bowl yet. 90,000 seat stadium, 23,000 empty seats. There might not have been much of an interest in that game. Green Bay beat Kansas City 35-10. The LA Coliseum is 1/3 empty. Now, a little later that month of January, the Apollo program is supposed to kick off. The Apollo program is to fulfill John Kennedy's desire to get men, particularly American men, to the moon before the end of the decade, 1969. And the Apollo program was supposed to do that. This is Gus Grissom. That is Edmund White, who was the first guy to walk in space, and that's Roger Chaffee. They're sitting on the launch pad, Cape Canaveral. It is late January 1967. They were supposed to go into space on February 21st, 1967, and this is the dress rehearsal. They're up in the capsule, they're going through all the things that they need to go through to see if the capsule works, to get acclimated to the command module, because the command module would eventually be part of the package to take men to the moon. So Grissom is in there, along with White and Chaffee, and on January 27th, they're killed. There's a spark in the spacecraft, there's pure oxygen in there, and basically it blew up. When you have a spark and pure oxygen, nothing good is going to happen. The command module, and that's all that was at that point, the command module, the Apollo 202 at that point, would be renamed Apollo 1, explodes. And that sets the space program back a year and a half. There's an inquiry as to why the craft exploded. They made changes, and by the time Apollo 7 comes around in October of 1968, they think they have fixed the problem that killed the 3 astronauts. Smothers Brothers. How many Smothers Brothers fans are in here who watched the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour? Did you like it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you liked it. Mike, did you like it? Smothers Brothers?
It was all right.
It was all right. Smothers Brothers would become the first counterculture show on TV. It was the first show designed to go after the hippies, designed to go after young professionals, people under the age of 35 who were college graduates who were making high incomes living in the suburbs. The show, 2 comedians. The Smothers Brothers had been on a dopey situation comedy on CBS. They were around, and all of a sudden CBS says, let's give the Smothers Brothers a variety show. Be careful what you wish for sometimes, because the Smothers Brothers eventually would gear the show to become totally anti-Vietnam. And also, it got Lyndon Johnson upset. Eventually, it would get Richard Nixon upset. Eventually, Tommy Smothers would be #1 on Richard Nixon's enemy list. But their show starts in 1967. It was going to be a little different show. It starts on February 5th. These were young comedians. This wasn't Jack Benny hosting a show anymore. This wasn't George Burns. This wasn't old-time radio guys who came over to TV. These were TV-bred comedians. And they were going to do a variety show, 1 hour every Sunday night. Eventually, they would get into big trouble with their commentary on the Vietnam War and other social aspects. But the show doesn't exactly start out like that on November 5th, 1967. Here's Martin Luther King. About a year prior to his assassination, Martin Luther King is in New York. He's at the Riverside Church, and he speaks out against Vietnam. You're beginning to see the protests against Vietnam. As the war escalates and escalates and escalates, and first of all, at this point, we don't even know why we're in Vietnam, except John Kennedy said, we're going to make sure that Vietnam doesn't fall to the communists. People are very confused in 1967. Just why are we there? And Martin Luther King decides to speak out and says, somehow, this madness must cease. Anybody burn a draft card here? Nobody burnt their draft cards. But you know about draft card burning, right? Mm-hmm. It was the first form of protest. People didn't want to go to Vietnam as the war is escalating and escalating. This is in Central Park in 1967. Burn your draft card. It's symbolic. But nonetheless, people are getting more and more upset about the Vietnam War. It was April 15th at the Sheep Meadow, Central Park, where students from Columbia University came down to burn their draft cards in Maxwell House coffee cans. They could just burn them like that. Did you drink Maxwell House in those days? Sanka? Remember the coffees back in those days? Sanka, Maxwell House coffee. So I used the Maxwell House. I'm surprised Andy Warhol didn't paint a Maxwell House coffee can. Painted a Campbell soup can. But anyway, that happened on April the 15th. More protests. Negotiate. Get out. Get us out of Vietnam. These are protesters. San Francisco. The protests start. There's something called the Spring Moby. 300,000 people protest in New York and in San Francisco, April 15th, 1967. It was founded in 1966, November of 1966, this group, the Spring Mobilization Committee, to end the war in Vietnam. The people who were protesting at that point in the media, not in the media, in the entertainment field, were folk singers. Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Tom Paxton, Peter, Paul and Mary, and Pete Seeger. It does not catch on until next year, but the protests begin to start. And that's Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali in 1967. Muhammad Ali was drafted, but it wasn't until 1967 that he was called down to the draft board. He was called up for induction in 1967 in Houston, Texas. was drafted in 1966. And he would go down to Houston, Texas on April 27th, go down to the draft board. Wanted to go in. And he was going to tell them face to face he was a conscientious objector. He refused to answer his name or take the oath. He was a conscientious objector. Muhammad Ali is arrested right afterwards. Muhammad Ali would give up his boxing career as soon as he refused to take the oath going into the military. Now, Muhammad Ali would have gotten simple jobs had he gotten into the military. Joe Louis used to fight occasionally, used to make appearances during World War II. Muhammad Ali was not going to Vietnam. He was not going to go to the front lines of Vietnam. But Muhammad Ali said, why should they ask me to put on a uniform, go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while the so-called Negro people in Louisville, he came from Louisville, Kentucky, are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights. That's me with Ali in 1985. Ali would end up fighting going into the military. In 1969, he was convicted of refusing to join the military service. He went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reversed the decision in 1971. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali gave up everything. He didn't really give up anything. It was all taken away from him. The New York State Boxing Commission took away his license without due process. They didn't call him up or give him due process. The World Boxing Association, he had a World Boxing Association title, took his title away without due process. He had no way to make a living. In 1968, there was something called the Cleveland Summit. A bunch of athletes in Cleveland, Ohio, led by Jim Brown. My friend Walt Flea Roberts was there, and a whole bunch of other people were there. And they called him in to find out if he was legitimate or if he was just trying to get out of military service. Ali convinced them he was legitimate. He was a conscientious objector. I have a friend who passed away February 16th of this year, Shelley Saltman. And Shelley was hired by Ali to promote his fight with Joe Frazier in 1971. And Shelley said, I'm here, you hired me, I'm going to do my job. He said, but I don't like you. I was a Korean War veteran. Shelley never saw action in Korean War, but he was a vet. And Muhammad Ali said to him, let's sit down, let's talk. After about an hour and a half, Shelley was convinced, as were the people at the Cleveland Summit, that Muhammad Ali was sincere to his beliefs that he should not serve in the military. I'll give you one more story about Ali that Shelley helped promote after he fought. Well, it wasn't a fight. It was a wrestler against a boxer around 1975, Antonio Inoki in Tokyo. And basically, Inoki kept kicking at his legs. He developed blood clots in his legs. Should have been hospitalized. But Ali was supposed to entertain the troops in South Korea the next day. Against doctor's orders, he goes to South Korea, risking death because he has an obligation to the troops. He's supposed to entertain them. He entertains them, then goes into the hospital with all kinds of problems with his legs after that fight. So he faced 5 years in prison, along with a $100,000 fine. His career, as of April 1967, is effectively over. He becomes the ultimate Vietnam protester. Six-Day War in Israel. That starts in June, but it goes back a little bit. In fact, it goes back a long time. By the mid-1960s, Syria backed Palestinian guerrillas, and they started staging attacks across the Israeli border. And there were raids from the Israeli Defense Forces. In 1967, the skirmishes would worsen. Syria would fight in the air and artillery, and there would be 6 Syrian jets that were destroyed. That's Nasser from Egypt. He gets some bad information from the Soviet Union. about Israel. And all of a sudden, he decides, we better do something about that. And they thought that there was going to be a full-scale invasion by the Israelis into Egypt and into Syria. So Nasser decides he's going to move troops all around the place, and then he's going to cut off waterways that Israel needed to get things shipped out. The United Nations peacekeeping force was thrown out. There they are, and they were thrown out of the area. On May the 22nd, Nasser decides that he's going to cut off the Straits of Tyrene. That's the passageway that connected the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aqaba, and that would cut off Israel being able to get stuff out. A week later, King Hussein of Jordan signs a defense pact with Egypt. The war starts, as you can see. It starts quickly. The weeks leading up to the war, Syria and Egypt are preparing for a war. Jordan was told, King Hussein was told, don't get involved with this war. You'll pay for it. Don't get involved. On June 5th, Israel struck. They destroyed 90% of the Egyptian Air Force. They also incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. The war was effectively over within 24 hours, although Syria and Egypt kept fighting and fighting and fighting. Within 3 days, it was over. It was a wrap by Israel. They beat Egypt. They beat Syria. They captured the Gaza Strip. They got all of the Sinai Peninsula and the land east of the Suez Canal. That was in 1967. What are we still talking about 52 years later? Same thing. Gaza Strip. Egypt didn't want the Gaza Strip back after the war. It's Moshe Dayan, who was the architect of the victory over Egypt and Syria. Israel all of a sudden doubled its size. Got Jerusalem, got the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, the West Bank. What are we still talking about 52 years later? Gaza Strip? We're not talking about the Sinai Peninsula. We're talking about the Golan Heights. We're talking about the West Bank. And the Americans are talking about moving the capital to Jerusalem. What's been accomplished in 5 decades?
Not much.
Not much. Not much at all. Arab leaders met in Khartoum in the Sudan in 1967, signed a resolution. No peace, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. The war continues until Anwar Sadat ends, at least the Egyptian part of the war. These guys. These guys. How many of you went out and bought Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? Mike, why would I kind of figured you would kind of buy that, right? Did you like it when you first heard it?
Very much.
It was a different type of rock album. It was a rock album that allegedly had a theme, although it really didn't have a theme. Frank Sinatra did theme albums in the 1950s. Come Fly With Me, all that. There was a theme to his albums. The Beatles stitched together an album with an alter ego because they were fed up with being Beatles. And they came up with all kinds of songs, and there were no singles off the song. You bought the album, you didn't buy the 45s. And it turned out to be the soundtrack, the rock soundtrack of 1967. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was #1 between June of 1967 and February of 1968. Total of 27 weeks, top of the charts. Initial chart run, 148 weeks. One song was banned on the album, A Day in the Life. And it was banned on the album because Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote these words: "I love to turn you on." Timothy Leary, turn on. All of a sudden, the BBC looked at it and said, that's a drug implication. We can't have that stuff on, even though if you listen to most of rock and roll, There's a lot of drug implications, a lot of drinking, and then Chuck Berry was upset with no particular place to go because that safety belt wouldn't move and he couldn't grab the girl. So it doesn't make any sense, but the BBC decided to ban the song A Day in the Life. Also going on, the Monterey Pop Festival. The Monterey Pop Festival, again, south of San Francisco. A lot of stuff taking place in San Francisco. And it's the breakout for people like Jimi Hendrix, for people like Janis Joplin. All of a sudden, the 36 acts, most of them totally unknown, become known overnight. The Beach Boys die there because they're not invited. They were no longer cool, the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys, Monterey kills them off. That's Otis Redding. What was Otis Redding's big song? Sitting at the dock of the bay. What bay? San Francisco Bay. Again, San Francisco, a major part of all this. Otis Redding, Ravi Shankar, Hugh Mascala, all have significant exposure because of the Monterey Pop Festival. Other acts there, Eric Burdon and the Animals, The Association, The Byrds, Jefferson Airplane, another San Francisco group, and the Mamas and the Papas. All of them performed at Monterey. Monterey would try, somebody in New York would try to capture the essence of Monterey. 2 years later, Woodstock. Most of the acts that played Monterey ended up in Woodstock in 1969. Meanwhile, the war keeps going on and on and on and is growing. The protesters are out more and more. Johnson is a war criminal. No destruction of Vietnam. Late 1950s, the Eisenhower administration decided that they were interested in Vietnam. Vietnam had split into a communist area in the north and South Korea. This is in the height of the Cold War. And the thinking was, if some other country like South Vietnam falls, it'll fall like a domino. Also, Cambodia would go and Laos would go, and you have to do something about it. John Kennedy takes office in 1961, and he makes a vow. South Vietnam is not going to fall to the communists. In January 1965, 5,400 men were called for the draft to go to Vietnam. By December of 1965, 45,000 men were called up. Monthly draft calls rose from 17,000 men a month, mostly teenagers and young men, to 35,000 per month. Young people began to see this impacting them and said, we got to do something. And they started protesting, and the protest becomes civil disobedience. Joan Baez, who is now retiring, she's on the final leg of her retirement tour. Her husband, David Harris, refused to go into the military and was jailed. She did protest songs, of course. George Harrison was in San Francisco. The Beatles were no longer a viable road band. They had quit in San Francisco in August of 1966. George Harrison decides to drop in to see what's going on at Haight-Ashbury. Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco is the epicenter of the hippie movement. It's all about the counterculture, the ideas in the counterculture, drugs, music. The neighborhood was a gathering spot. It was a social experiment that would soon spread throughout the United States. The hippie community had easy access to drugs. Drugs was considered a community unifier. Meanwhile, there was a group called the Diggers. They were formed in the mid to late 1960s, and they believed in a free society, the good in human nature. They established a free store, gave out free meals daily in Haight-Ashbury, built a medical clinic, a free medical clinic, which relied on volunteers and donations. There were people unhappy in San Francisco, like the mayor of San Francisco and the San Francisco Police Department, both of whom looked at hippies as freeloaders, and they wanted to get the freeloaders out of San Francisco. Scott McKenzie, Had a hit song, huge hit song. San Francisco. If you're going to San Francisco, remember to wear flowers in your hair. San Francisco became the destination point for your peers. Your peers. Not my peers, because I was only 11 years old, but your peers ended up in San Francisco with Scott McKenzie. Be sure to wear flowers in your hair. The Monterey Pop Festival cemented the status of psychedelic music. Although it wasn't called psychedelic music, but it became psychedelic music. Psychedelics linked to drugs, like LSD, which was outlawed. They cemented the status of psychedelic music as part of the culture. Elevated Haight-Ashbury groups such as the Grateful Dead. How many Grateful Dead fans are here who like Grateful Dead? Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Janis Joplin, and the Jefferson Airplane to superstardom. All because of Monterey and in San Francisco. Now, people who came to San Francisco with the flowers in their hair, people of various ages, teenagers, college students. Their peers wanted them then. It was the allure of joining a cultural utopia. Middle-class vacationers went to San Francisco. And those guys going off to Vietnam. One last trip by bus across the bay to San Francisco because they didn't know if they were ever going to come back. Now, you were all around in the 1960s. In 1967, did any of this impact you?
Yeah, I lived in Oakland and San Francisco.
Yeah, tell me about it.
I can't remember.
You can't, then you know what? Then you must have enjoyed being in San Francisco.
I did.
Did you go there or were you native to San Francisco?
I was born and raised in Oakland.
In Oakland.
And I worked downtown San Francisco for 20 years.
Did you? But you don't remember 1967.
Oh, I do.
Oh, you do? So tell me about it.
No, I can't.
You know what? Dinner tonight, go to her table. Go to her table and say, now tell me about San Francisco. Did you have flowers in your hair?
Yep, and all the hippies were there too, and the bisexual people, tons of them.
Now, you had the flowers in your hair and you hung out with the hippies. So you knew Timothy Leary.
Probably.
Who he was.